Shalom l'kulam. Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. I think many people on this at this meeting will know that and will know me and will be regular attendees of these Wednesday events. Some of you may be new. I assume everyone knows what they're here for, that you didn't just click on the link and sort of just seeing what comes up. We're doing something a little bit different today. Usually on a Wednesday, I am speaking to, or we're hearing a lecture from an expert from academia or journalism or politics to talk about an issue around current affairs or the Middle East or the Jewish world or Israeli history. And today it's me doing basically what I'm calling a beginner's guide to the new government. The purpose of this is some of you may have attended one that I did just before the last elections, which was really primarily to help Olim Chadashim, new immigrants in Israel, decide how they're going to vote by laying out for them what the issues were and what the parties represented, and sort of to get through some of the confusion that I know it surrounds much of Israeli politics, especially for new immigrants, but also for observers outside Israel that aren't so clued in to what's happening here. And this is basically a sequel to that. I received a few emails from people who were saying, there's this new government. Naftali Bennett is now the prime minister after Netanyahu, after the end of this record-breaking run from Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister. How did that happen? We're not quite sure. We haven't really been following it, or we tried to follow it. It was a bit confusing. And I get that, and that's fair. So what I wanted to do was to try and sketch out really what happened and why, and expand on some of the important talking points about the new government and the opposition, now led by Netanyahu, of course. And after that, to answer whatever questions anyone has. And I want to give plenty of time for questions, because that's really the point of this. It's an informational event, essentially. And the idea is that you will come away from this wiser than you started, more informed than you started, should we say. So I'm going to use, as last time, I'm going to use a PowerPoint. I'll try and get through it all in about 20, 25 minutes, and then go to questions, which you can write in the chat. You can write them as they come up. I'll deal with them at the end of my presentation, but I don't want you to forget them. So write them in the chat as they enter your heads. And we'll go from there. So let me just make sure that this is working. Okay, I'm assuming everyone can see that. I hope everyone can see that. Right, so that's the question, is what on earth just happened in Israeli politics? You could say the title is appropriate because this is a beginner's guide, and it's sort of a surprising situation for many people. But actually, I think even for Israelis and for veteran observers of Israeli politics, this is very much a what on earth just happened, because it is unprecedented in a number of ways, which we'll talk about. So the first thing to say, and this is the only slide which I'm repeating from the session I did before the elections, and it's just very quickly to go over the system here for those people that are not familiar with it, especially for I think for people maybe from the United States, which has a completely different system, of course. We have multiple parties. It's not a two-party system like the US. The election in March resulted in 13 parties being represented in the Knesset. We have 13 parties sitting in the Knesset right now. 8 of them now sit in the new government coalition, and 5 are in the opposition. So we have a proportional representation system of government. Very simple. It's the only thing really that is simple about the Israeli system, which is the voting itself. That on election day, you vote for a party, and then the party essentially receives the amount of seats in the 120-seat Knesset that its share of the vote dictates. So if a party were to win 25% of the national vote, they would receive 25% of the seats in the Knesset, 30 seats out of 120. Elections are held every 4 years. In theory, in practice, governments rarely last the full 4 years, and they collapse frequently because of disagreements between the constituent parties in the coalition. The last government collapsed because a budget, they were not able to agree on a budget. I don't particularly want to go into it unless people want me to, in which case they can ask the question. But essentially, Netanyahu de facto collapsed the government by not agreeing to the budget agreement that he had made initially with Benny Gantz. Usually the largest party in an election is given the job of forming a government that represents more than half the Knesset, so they have to partner with other parties to reach that magic number of 61 seats. And as we'll see this time around, it was not the largest party in the Knesset that did that. Okay, so this is the new Knesset. Now, these are the parties, these are the numbers of seats that they got, just a few points on the names. You'll see second left, Kachol Levan, that's blue and white. The confusing thing about reading about Israeli politics in English is that some parties translate their name into English, like blue and white, and some parties keep the Hebrew, like Yisrael Beitenu or Likud. Or merits. So it's sometimes it's confusing, but Kachol Levan is blue and white for those of you more familiar with the English name. The party called the United Arab List, which you can see kind of in the middle in grey with 4 seats, you may have seen written as RAM. That's the Hebrew acronym for United Arab List. Now, the most notable thing about this is that usually when these kinds of diagrams are put together, are produced, these illustrations, the parties are divided into left and right, right? So usually after an election, a coalition is formed, and the coalition tends to be a coalition of like-minded parties, more or less. There are exceptions, but generally speaking, if it's a party that's being formed by the Likud, which is the main right-wing party, then the Likud will look for right-wing coalition partners first and foremost. And if, as in the old days, hasn't happened for a while, but the traditional main left-wing party, the Labour Party, would look for left-wing or centre-left partners. And that makes a lot of sense. So usually you would see the parties divided into 2 blocks, one left-leaning block and one right-leaning block. As I explained in my talk before the election, in Israel, at least for the last 40 years, let's say, when we talk about left and right, we are not usually referring to positions on the economy or taxation or government spending or the things that people usually mean when they say left and right in the United States or Britain or France or other countries, but on the major political question for Israel for the past 40, 50 years, which is the question of the future of the territories, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, formerly Gaza, the issue of a 2-state solution or not, the issue of building settlements or not building settlements. And left and right has tended to mean your position on those things, right? A left-wing person traditionally would be opposed to settlement building, in favor of a 2-state solution and a Palestinian state. A right-leaning person would obviously traditionally, and this is a generalization, but would want to build, would be in favor of building more settlements, would be opposed to a Palestinian state. and withdrawing from territory, etc. I think that's generally well known. Here we have something else, right? Here we don't have left-wing bloc and right-wing bloc. We have the anti-Netanyahu bloc and the pro-Netanyahu bloc, which is extremely telling and indicates the extent to which this election, and indeed the last few elections, have been about the person of Benjamin Netanyahu and his suitability or not to remain as prime minister. If we look at the pro-Netanyahu bloc, those four parties, that camp is made up entirely of right-wing or religious parties. The anti-Netanyahu camp, however, includes parties of the left, the center, and of the right. And then you have another right-wing party, Yamina, in gray, a party which its very name means right-leaning or rightwards or turn right. And it's in this gray uncommitted area, right? It meaning before the election, Naftali Bennett, the leader of Yamina, refused to say whether he would support Netanyahu's continuing as prime minister or not. In fact, he said that he thought that he should be prime minister, which ended up happening, but that certainly wasn't the prediction of most people. And we can get into more specifics about the positions of different parties if you like, and you can ask me those questions when we get into it. But just some general statements about the anti and pro Netanyahu blocks. Now, the anti-Netanyahu bloc contains parties that were generally positive about much of Netanyahu's tenure, even actually some that would say that he was a great prime minister up to a certain point. And it includes parties that were always his implacable political opponents. What they agree on now, and what they agreed on before the election, was that now Netanyahu needs to go. And for most of them, and I think this covers basically all the parties in that list, possibly apart from New Hope, which is the right-wing party of former Likud members. With the exception of New Hope, the other parties were essentially united in a position which said it's absurd, even outrageous, that a prime minister who is facing 3 counts of corruption in court, charges which, if proven, could end in a prison sentence, that such a man remains in office. And even though there is no specific law in Israel which says he has to quit, that it's one of those things that's just a norm, that, you shouldn't need a law for this. It should be obvious that when you're in that position, you don't stay as prime minister. This is the language used by some of these critics, this is kind of banana republic stuff, right? This isn't what a serious modern democracy, how a serious modern democracy is supposed to operate. New Hope, the party, as I said, which is made up of basically people who left the Likud, led by Gideon Sa'ar, a senior Likud minister. New Hope contains actually a lot of people who are sympathetic to Netanyahu's claims that the charges against him amount to a witch hunt, even a conspiracy. But where they agree with the other parties is that as a result of these charges, as a result of the court cases, Netanyahu, or partially as a result of that, Netanyahu has become so obsessed with staying in power at all costs that he is putting himself and his own needs ahead of the country's needs, right? And this when New Hope was established, there were speeches made by some of the senior Likud members who left, explaining why they were turning their back on the party that they had been members of for their entire lives in politics. And they basically said, we would sit in cabinet meetings, some of them were ministers, we would sit in cabinet meetings and we would see time after time the prime minister would be talking about his own issues and the things that he needed to do to help himself and not the needs of the country. And that's that's basically what unites the anti-Netanyahu bloc. The pro-Netanyahu bloc contains a combination of the following. On the one hand, people that are convinced, I think genuinely convinced that this is a witch hunt and a conspiracy against the prime minister, that the left could not defeat him at the ballot box, that he's Israel's most successful prime minister, longest serving prime minister. And so they basically conspired with Netanyahu's enemies in the media and in the judiciary and other parts of what they might call, and what Netanyahu has called, the deep state, to essentially remove him from office through non-democratic means. And certainly, I think some in the Likud do buy into that. There are other people in other parties, and maybe also in the Likud, who are willing to accept that he's done things he shouldn't, but nevertheless, he has been such a great leader, such a giant of a figure and a statesman, that he's still head and shoulders above all the other contenders for the prime minister, and basically innocent until proven guilty. Let the court case play out. In the meantime, he should remain as prime minister. And then, of course, there are others who are supporting him for, shall we say, more political reasons. So, for example, I imagine, and obviously this is speculation, there are probably some in the Likud who maybe secretly, privately, think the same as some of their fellow Likudniks who left for New Hope, but they think that their political careers are better protected by remaining in the Likud and supporting Netanyahu, who's still very popular with the Likud base. And it's not in their political interests to oppose him. And then, of course, you have the two Haredi ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas and United Torah Judaism, who basically have a very long-standing arrangement with Netanyahu, in which they have become, over the past decade, his most reliable and steadfast supporters, sticking by him through thick and thin. And in return, he gives them more or less the policies that they want, that they need for their voters. So that's sort of where things stand. So that's the Knesset. Now this is the government and the opposition that we now have, that we've had for the past week and a half, basically. Before, I am going to go into more detail about how we got here, but before we do, I'll just say a few words about this the coalition and opposition. As you can see, it's a government, a coalition with the smallest possible majority, right? 61 seats, right? Which makes it a very potentially unstable and fragile coalition. One person leaving, one member of Knesset defecting, and it could all collapse. Certainly two, because then it could give the opposition a majority potentially. One thing you may notice, those of you that have an eye for detail and a good memory, may have noted that in the last table in the Knesset, you'll see that Yamina here, I'm hovering the mouse over, has 7 seats in the Knesset. And here, it's in the coalition with 6 seats. Now, that's because one of their members defected to the opposition. So one member of Yamina, elected with the party, elected by voters of Yamina, a guy called Amichai Shikli, basically quit. He still, I think, formally regards himself as part of Yamina, but he said that he cannot go along with his leader Naftali Bennett's coalition talks with Yair Lapid, because he's against forming a government with left-wing parties. He believes that Yamina should only be in a government with other right-wing parties, or certainly a government that's dominated by right-wing parties. So he left, and this, of course, by the way, when this happened, this started a whole discussion in the media and in the Knesset itself as to if one more person leaves from Yamina, then they're not going to be able to form a government. They're not going to be able to form this government. In the end, that didn't happen and hasn't happened yet. So that therefore we have this government. But it does remain a threat to the stability and the longevity of this government. Another thing to note is the two Arab parties. So there are two Arab factions, two Arab lists, I should say, in the Knesset. One is the joint list, which is made up of three separate parties. And the other is RAM, the United Arab List, which was formerly part of the joint list, and then it split off from them and ran independently this time. And actually, it was the joint list that was in the anti-Netanyahu camp that were like, we will absolutely refuse to support in any circumstances Netanyahu remaining prime minister. And it was RAM, you may recall, who were in that undecided category. The leader of RAM, Mansour Abbas, like Naftali Bennett, before the election said, I'm not going to say, I'm keeping my options open. I'm not going to say who I'm supporting for prime minister. In the end, RAM went with this new coalition. Indeed, was the deciding factor that enabled it to be formed. Whereas the joint list refused to join because as much as they are unequivocally opposed to Netanyahu as prime minister, they also object to serving in a government with Naftali Bennett as prime minister. Naftali Bennett is a right-wing figure, very much associated with the settlement movement in Judea and Samaria. And the joint list, unlike RAM, and we'll talk about that, take a part of their agenda is very much an affinity with and an allegiance with the Palestinian national cause in Judea and Samaria and Gaza. RAM have departed from that. Right. So let's go back. After the election, the first attempt to form a government was awarded to the leader of the largest party, Likud, Benjamin Netanyahu. That's not always the case. It's basically the president, one of the roles that the president of Israel has, which the president is a largely ceremonial role, but one of the important jobs that he has is to give the mandate to form a government to the leader of the party most likely to be able to form a government. And that was assumed to be at the beginning Netanyahu because he had the most support from the parties that were elected. There were plenty of parties that didn't want Netanyahu, but also weren't willing to support Yair Lapid, the leader of Yesh Atid, either. So Netanyahu was given this mandate to form a government. Now, as you can see, he starts off with 52 in his corner, right? He has the Likud and Shas and United Torah Judaism and the Religious Zionism Party firmly in his camp, and he needs to get to 61 at least. So how does he do that? Now, Naftali Bennett did agree in principle to join, right? Yamina's 7 seats would have taken Netanyahu up to 59, almost there, but not quite. But it has to be said that even though Bennett did say that he would agree to join, and even that this was his preference, that a right-wing government was his preference, everyone knew that he was also talking quietly with Yair Lapid behind the scenes in case Netanyahu was not able to form a government, and he wanted to and there was that option was open. And people also knew, by the way, that part of that if that were to happen, if Netanyahu would have failed to form a government and the mandate switched to Lapid, that Bennett could well become prime minister in that circumstance, because that would be the condition that he would insist on to Lapid. Netanyahu, knowing this, actually went against his, I think, personal wishes and better judgment, perhaps, and also offered Bennett a rotation, at the prime ministership. So why did this end up not happening? Because, of course, 59 is not enough. They also needed RAM, the United Arab List. And RAM, Mansour Abbas, did actually, in principle, also say that he was willing to join Netanyahu if certain conditions were met, if he received the types of the agenda, the issues on his political agenda that he wanted to and Netanyahu indicated that he would, at least most of the things that Abbas wanted. So why was this not formed? Well, the problem was the religious Zionism party, this party of 6 seats here, led by Bezalel Smotrich. And Smotrich basically said he would not sit in a coalition supported by RAM. Even if RAM were not formally in the coalition, but were just supporting it from the outside, he would not sit in a coalition that was reliant on the votes of RAM. He was very clear that other right-wing parties, Likud, Yamina, and others were willing to compromise on their principles. We're different. We are a right-wing party that sticks to our guns, that sticks to our principles. We will not sit in a government supported by this party, which Smotrich accused of being a supporter of terrorism and other things. And basically, Bibi couldn't form the coalition. A lot of pressure was put on Smotrich, including not just from the Likud, but also Netanyahu recruited many rabbis from the religious Zionist camp to put pressure on Smotrich, but he didn't back down. And the coalition was not, Bibi was not able to form the coalition in the allotted time. The mandate switched to Lapid, Yair Lapid, leader of the second largest party after the elections, Yesh Atid. And Lapid ultimately succeeded with this very strange coalition that he's put together. Actually, let's just go back to this as the coalition. A party made up of Yesh Atid, blue and white, two center parties, Labour and Meretz, two left-wing parties, Yisrael Beitenu, a right-wing party essentially, but also has a liberal position on religion and state, and then New Hope and Yamina, which are firmly right-wing parties, and then of course RAM, this Arab party, the first time in Israel's history that an Arab party has entered government coalition. Right, this is the very peculiar, unprecedented coalition that we now have. Lapid, as the leader of the largest party, might have assumed, or it would have been assumed by many, I think, that he would be the prime minister in such a coalition. Bennett insisted that he would only join the coalition under the conditions that there'd be a rotation of prime ministership, and that he go first, that Bennett go first. And so we have this peculiar situation where the leader of a party that won 7 seats in the 120-seat Knesset, and indeed now is reduced to 6 seats because of the one a member who left in protest, is the prime minister. And by the way, this position was also supported by Gideon Sa'ar of New Hope. So you had these two right-wing parties, New Hope and Yamina, who said, look, we're entering a coalition in which we are a minority. It's a coalition made up primarily of left-wing and center parties. And we're a minority as right-wing parties. And so the only way we can live with this, the only way we can ensure essentially that this government isn't going to lean too far to the left, is if we have a right-wing prime minister. And so that was the agreement. That was the agreement that was made. And Bennett went first. The list of cabinet, this isn't the entire cabinet, of course, here that I've listed here. These are what I've done here is I've listed the leaders of the parties that are in the coalition and the positions that they hold. If you have questions about other cabinet positions, I can tell you, and other parties. By the way, Mansour Abbas, the leader of RAM, is not a cabinet minister. He does not sit in the cabinet. He does have a deputy minister role with a special responsibility for Arab affairs. but he doesn't sit in the cabinet. Now, this isn't actually the first rotation government Israel's had, as weird as a concept as that sounds to many outside Israel. We actually had a rotation government, a surprisingly stable and successful rotation government in the 1980s, when basically the Labour and Likud parties formed a rotation, and Shimon Peres was prime minister for 2 years, and Yitzhak Shamir, the leader of the Likud, was prime minister for the next 2 years. But this time, this is different in one very important way. It's basically modeled, ironically, on the complete innovation that Netanyahu came up with last year in order to persuade Benny Gantz to join him in a rotation. So Netanyahu and Gantz were not just, it wasn't a rotation like Peres and Shamir. When Peres was prime minister, Shamir was just another minister, I think foreign minister. And then then it switched around after 2 years. Shamir became prime minister and Peres was foreign minister. With Netanyahu and Gantz, when Netanyahu was prime minister and Gantz had this new position which had not existed previously in Israeli politics of alternate prime minister. That doesn't just mean that he's going to be prime minister after the rotation. It also means that while Netanyahu was prime minister, Gantz had a veto on policy decisions made by the cabinet. And the same would have been the case had Gantz been prime minister, but which obviously didn't end up happening. We didn't get to that part of the rotation. And that's the same arrangement here. Bennett has the title of prime minister and the trappings of prime minister, and he's the one who's going to be, if President Biden comes to Israel and has a press conference, he's going to be standing on the dais with Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, right? But essentially, Lapid is to all intents and purposes, co-prime minister. And the same will be the case when Lapid takes over with Bennett. What this means in practice is that on the issues which do strongly divide Lapid and Bennett, there's not going to be much movement under this government because they would veto each other. So most obviously, the best and I think most apparent example is on the Palestinian question and the future of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, right? So Bennett would love to go on a settlement building spree, maybe even annexing parts of the West Bank, and he can't do that. I mean, there might be other reasons why he wouldn't do that for international pressure and other things, but he cannot do that because Lapid would veto it. When Lapid becomes prime minister in 2 years' time, if the government lasts, he might want to embark on some kind of renewal of the peace process, of negotiating with Palestinians. And if that does happen, the conditions for that would be very severely restrained and restricted by Bennett. There certainly wouldn't be a settlement freeze, which we had 10 years ago or so. There certainly wouldn't be any agreements on things that Bennett and the Israeli right would object to. So what's going to happen instead, and this has already been agreed between Bennett and Lapid and the other parties, is they're going to focus on consensus issues. They're going to focus on the economy and infrastructure and investing in health and recovering from Corona. They're also going to do some things which are to do with changing aspects of Israeli governance that they all agree on. The headline piece of that is term limits for the prime minister. So one of the parties in this coalition would say that one of the lessons learned from the Netanyahu era is that we need to have term limits, that a prime minister shouldn't be allowed to be in power for such a long time. So they're going to set term limits. I think they're talking about 8 years or 2 terms, whichever ends up being the longest or something like that. And there are other things that are being talked about as well in terms of changing aspects of the structure of Israeli government, separation of powers, the relationship between the Knesset and the Supreme Court. and other things like that. But basically, they're going to focus on issues which they can agree on. Now, this may end up collapsing the government. It might be that the contradictions become too great, that the issues that divide them become too pronounced, possibly. Or it might be that they actually succeed beyond the expectations of many in really making headway on issues which have been neglected for some time in Israel, because we've been dealing with more, should we say, political issues over recent years. Bennett and Lapid, by the way, although they disagree on a few things very strongly, in their general worldview, they're actually not so different. In many ways, you could see them in a kind of modern Israeli sense as a kind of secular and religious, so the secular and religious two sides of the same coin. They're both very, they're sort of comfortably middle-class Tel Aviv types, cosmopolitan, very successful professionally. They have a similar worldview on a number of things. A lot of people might look at the kippah on Bennett and the lack of a kippah on Lapid and make all kinds of assumptions. But actually, although Bennett is clearly right-wing on the issues that most people think of when they think of right-wing in Israel, he's actually pretty liberal on a bunch of other things, on women's rights, on minorities, even gay rights. He's not a hardline conservative at all. Lapid, although he's been called a leftist for the past 2 years at least by Netanyahu, he defines himself as a centrist rather than a leftist. He makes a big point of calling himself this. Certainly many on the left don't regard him as being part of the left. And he's very hawkish on security issues. You're not going to see, for example, a lot of daylight between Bennett and Lapid on dealing with Hamas or on the Iran threat. It's an interesting, that's an interesting point as well. Okay, I'm going ahead of time. I just want to finish with this because we shouldn't forget that Benjamin Netanyahu is not, he might be out of office, but he's not out of the picture at all. He is leader of the opposition, and he's made it very clear since leaving office that he's going to take leader of the opposition very seriously. He's going to act in ways that perhaps previous leaders of the opposition have not acted, with fewer restraints, I would say. He's made it very clear that he does not see this government as legitimate, not in the Trump sense, right? He's not arguing that voting was tampered with or that the vote count was in some way not done properly, or there was some funny business with the voting. He's saying that basically that Bennett misled his voters. That he's saying that Bennett stole votes from the right, basically, that he portrayed himself as a right winger, and now after getting into the Knesset with 7 seats, he's forming what Netanyahu calls a left-wing government, and it's clear that Netanyahu is not just intent on bringing down the government, which many would say is the job of a leader of the opposition, but actually, even as much as he can, sabotaging the possibility of success of the government in a host of different ways. Now, a lot can happen in the next few months. There's a lot of speculation. This is an unprecedented government, as I've said a few times. The government could collapse under the weight of its contradictions. There could be developments in Netanyahu's court cases. On the one hand, there could be developments which seriously point towards his guilt, and which convince enough in the Likud to turn on him and remove him from leadership. On the other hand, the court case could could collapse. The charges could collapse, exonerating him essentially. And that could persuade maybe one or two from Yamina or even New Hope to defect to the Likud, essentially bringing down the government. Another possibility, by the way, is in the last few days, the new government opened an official independent commission of inquiry into the disaster at Meron a couple of months ago. I assume everyone is familiar with what I'm talking about. If not, let me know and I'll explain it. But this commission into Meron was opposed by the Likud and by the two ultra-Orthodox parties. And before this new government came into office, when Netanyahu was still prime minister, and there was the previous government, they were not. They were going to set up something that was going to be much less independent. Basically, it was going to be essentially controlled by the government, and a less powerful commission of inquiry. And many think that's because the commission could uncover massive negligence on the part of people in government, including possibly Netanyahu himself, the ultra-Orthodox establishment that was responsible for the Meron site, the public security minister, Amir Ohana, who was a Likud minister. So if that uncovers a whole bunch of stuff, that could also affect the possibility of could also harm Netanyahu's chances, perhaps, of returning to power. So a whole bunch of things could happen, which could tip the scales one way or the other. I'm going to finish there. I see that I have a few questions. I'm going to stop the share and get back to you all. And let's see what questions we have. Okay. So, has there ever been a government formed by a small minority party in the past? So the answer is no. Nothing like this. Every previous prime minister of Israel has been the leader of either the largest party or, in one or two cases, the second largest party, but certainly a party representing a significant proportion of the votes of Israeli voters. This is a first. I think I was researching this a while ago. This is unusual in parliamentary democracies generally, but not unheard of. There are other countries in the world in which this has happened. I think right now there are a couple of European countries. I think one is Belgium. I forget which the other one is, in which the prime minister is a representative of a party with only a few seats. And it's for similar reasons. They have a coalition government, and that the price of the coalition was, for all kinds of reasons, which I'm not familiar with, the leader of this smaller party becoming prime minister. There's a question. I thought the coalition only passed with 60 seats, not 61. No, they got to 61. Sorry, actually, you're right. The vote for the government, you're right, was just 60 seats. There was one member of Ram who did not vote in favor, but they needed, essentially how it works is you don't need 61 votes to form the government. You just need to not have 61 voting against you. So the fact that it was 60, the fact that there weren't 61 against was enough for the government to be formed. But now the government is formed. It represents 61 seats in the Knesset because the member of Ram who didn't vote said that he does support the government. It was a kind of protest. He had some issues with certain things that were agreed, where Ram didn't get exactly what it wanted. But it was a protest by not voting. He knew it wasn't going to stop the government being formed. We have a question here from Denise Gilbert. Ram also refused to sit with Smotrich. Smotrich's right to refuse to have an Arab party in the government. Okay, so yes, sorry, you are right. Well, okay, so Ram did say initially that they would not sit with Smotrich. And I'm not sure if it was someone. It might have been Smotrich. It might have been the fact that Smotrich's party contained a faction which is part of a very far right part of Israeli politics, descendants of Meir Kahana's Kach party. For those familiar with it, Otzma Yehudit. That might have also been part of Ram's opposition. My guess is, and I think this was borne out. I think this was assumed by most commentators. If Smotrich had gone with it in the end, and Netanyahu had given Abbas everything he wanted, I think Ram would have ended up supporting the government. I think they would have swallowed their opposition to Smotrich. When you say Smotrich is right to refuse to have an Arab party in the government, that's not a question. That's your opinion, which you're entitled to. But I mean, unless you particularly want me to address it, I'm not sure what I can really say to that. Emma Avital asked, Paul, what would Menachem Begin think about this new government? I was warned a long time ago, or not warned. The example I got from the head of the Begin Center is not to make assumptions about what Menachem Begin would think today about this or that, because we can all speculate. And the truth is that people with very, very different politics in Israel today claim that Menachem Begin would support their positions. Look, I want to think if I can say something that's intelligent and not and doesn't do a disservice to the idea that we shouldn't speculate about such things. Begin, I think one thing we can say is that Begin would have been absolutely appalled at what's happened in Israeli politics of late. That Begin believed in good governance, that he believed very, very strongly in the strength of the part of the strength of Israel was the strength of Israeli democracy. I think he would not have approved of the fact that we've had 4 elections in 2 years, and that certain people in Israeli politics have been the way that they've been doing politics. I don't think he would have approved of. It certainly wasn't the way that Begin did politics. This new government, I'm not going to speculate. I would say, put it this way. Anyone you ask in the Likud today would tell you that Begin would have been completely against this government. Anyone that you ask in New Hope, which is also made up of people who claim to be followers of Menachem Begin, and Yair Lapid, who grew up in a house in which Begin was very much a political hero, and Lapid claims Begin as a very much an inspiration, would say that Begin would support the government. So there you go. Annie Sorno asked, did the defector from Yamina resign so the next on the list take his place, or he joined Likud? Now, this is kind of an ethical issue. Amichai Shikli, the gentleman in question, did not resign. He could have chosen to resign, in which case his place in Yamina would have been taken by the next on the list, who may have been someone, probably would have been someone, I imagine, that would have supported the government, and then Bennett would have had the extra seat. He decided not to do that, but simply to remain in the government. He did not join the Likud. He's basically sitting in the Knesset as an independent. It basically means he's a member of Knesset. He can vote. I think there are certain things he can't do. I think as someone who's not now formally part of one of the parties in the Knesset, I think he cannot get positions on the major committees in the Knesset. But he can vote, and he will be voting primarily with the opposition on most issues, I assume. Joanna Lane, can you speak about the scene in the Knesset on the day of the swearing in of the government? Was the heckling, insults, and generally disrespectful behavior that we saw a common occurrence when a new prime minister speaks, or was that worse than normal? It was worse than normal. It was much worse than normal. Look, the Knesset is a very rowdy place, and you will see many, a lot of heckling and shouting, and people being asked to leave by the speaker for their behavior. That happens probably on a weekly, certainly a monthly basis in the Knesset. And even the prime minister can be shouted down. What is unprecedented is the newly elected prime minister giving his inaugural speech as prime minister being heckled in that way. That was completely unprecedented, and really, I think, not something that any of the people involved in should be proud of. Yeah, that's my answer to that. what is behind the decision that Bennett should be PM first? Well, it was Bennett's condition. Bennett, and it's not just Bennett. It's also, you could make a case that actually Bennett's party, you could make a case that Bennett is possibly the most liberal member of his own party, that other members of his party are more hardline than him on many issues, and that other members of his party, including maybe even especially Ayelet Shaked, who's the most senior member of the party after Bennett, a former justice minister, that they would not have been willing to sit in the government if Lapid had gone first. Now, cynics might say that this is not a good sign and that it tells us that when Lapid's time comes, they're going to bolt the government, that they're not going to sit with Lapid, and that they never intended to sit with Lapid and all of that. Maybe, maybe not. It might just be that they needed, look, Bennett was under a lot of pressure. Netanyahu was saying, you stole votes from the right, your voters didn't vote you in order to sit in this government. And it is true that Bennett, before the election, explicitly said that he would not sit in a government with a government of the left and centre. He went back on that. Unquestionably, he went back on that promise to his voters. That said, he also promised that he would do anything to avoid fifth elections. So he could claim that he would have had to break one of those promises, because the only way to prevent fifth elections was to get into this government. So I think that is certainly, I think, one of his arguments. But in any case, Bennett was under a lot of pressure from his own side. And one way to maybe appease his voters was to say, look, I'm going to be prime minister. You voted for me because you want to be as prime minister. And that, by the way, he can claim, because Bennett ran on one of his issues was, I think I should be prime minister. I'm not supporting Netanyahu as prime minister. I should be prime minister. And if you want Netanyahu as prime minister, vote Likud. Don't vote for me. So Bennett can reasonably claim that the people who voted for him, who elected 7 members of Yamina to the Knesset, wanted Bennett to be prime minister. And they got what they wanted. He's prime minister. Not in the government of their dreams, for sure. And Netanyahu would say, not in the government that they would have wanted in any circumstances. But, this is trying to read the minds of the voters of Yamina, who I'm sure are a diverse bunch of people in any case. So that's why Bennett was first. He really had to do that in order to assuage his own side. Eliyahu says the new government is based on broken promises to the voters. Okay, that's not a question, but maybe you want to ask me if I agree with that. There are definitely broken promises as part of this government. As I said, primarily Bennett's promise not to sit in the government with the centre and the left. That said, if we're going to be even-handed about this, as I said, he also promised that he would do anything to prevent fifth elections. And this was the only way he would claim that he could do that. He would say he tried to get to a right-wing government with Netanyahu. That was not possible because Smotrich vetoed it, essentially. And so this way he has that. Also, by the way, Netanyahu also said before the election that under no circumstances would he form a government supported by Iran. He then entered into negotiations with Iran to form a government, right? So Bennett is by no means the only one who, if Netanyahu had been successful in forming a government, that government would also have been a government based on some broken promises. Mickey Green, is it possible that we should be seeing a more national consensus-orientated and less party-oriented form of policymaking? Look, that's the hope. There's a pessimistic and an optimistic view of this government. I mean, aside from politics, I mean, you could obviously take a political view and say approve or disapprove of this government because of your own politics, right? But if you look at it from a non-partisan way, there's a pessimistic and optimistic view. The pessimistic view says it's not gonna last. It's too diverse. There are too many differences. There are too many contradictions. It's going to collapse. The optimistic view is something along the lines of what you're saying, right? That this could be an opportunity for a government to focus not on the issues that divide us, like settlements and pushing for a Palestinian state, and issues around some issues around religion and state, which are divisive. The right left, the real right left fault lines in Israeli society, but to focus on the consensus issues, on the things that every Israeli wants to see more investment in the healthcare system. Every Israeli wants to see improvements made to education in this country. Every Israeli wants to see issues of, find a way to recover economically from Corona, right? And these are things which this government can focus on, and where there is broad agreement among most of the parties on most of the issues. Look, Lapid, and in many ways, even though Bennett is prime minister, this is Lapid's government in the sense that Lapid was the man who made this happen. Lapid was the one who was doing essentially bringing the different pieces of this together. And one of his, this is the sort of his great achievement in Israeli politics, is the creation of this government. It may or may not turn out to be a success, we'll see. But it's certainly his achievement up to now. And Lapid has always said that his approach to politics, and one of the ways in which he sort of defined himself as this centrist figure, was that if we can agree on 80% of the issues, let's ignore the 20% that we don't agree on and get to work on the 80%. And that, I think, is the mantra of this government. And we'll see if it lasts a year, 2 years, 3 years, which would be incredible, and they could do some really important and necessary things in Israel, or whether it ends up being a disaster and collapses. Both of those possibilities are open before us. Annie Sorno says, where do the trials on Bibi stand? I mean, I don't know specific details of, it's an ongoing process. This is going to take a while. Court cases in Israel tend to take a while generally, but this in particular is high profile. It's very complicated. It's three separate cases against Netanyahu. There's a lot of it involved. So it's going to take a long time to get through. So where they stand is really where they've stood for the past few months, which is that they're ongoing. There was talk. I saw some supporters of Netanyahu writing and tweeting that one of the cases is close to collapse. I haven't heard that from other sources, from more neutral sources, so I don't know how true that is. It might be. So we'll see. I don't know. Sveberg says, I believe that the establishment of additional settlements were approved today. Okay, I didn't hear that. It's possible. Look, one thing is certainly possible is that settlements that were already, where the tenders were already made and they were basically already approved by the previous government, that those are not going to be rescinded. So that might be what happened. If it's additional settlements approved, I don't know about that. I imagine if that is the case, it would be within what's called the settlement blocks, which are the main, regarded as the Israeli consensus. Basically, the blocks, generally speaking, adjacent to the Green Line, next around Jerusalem, which most people, even on the left, assume will remain part of Israel, even in the event of a two-state solution with the Palestinians. That would be my guess. If I'm wrong, Sviberg, if I'm wrong, then let me know. But I don't know about that announcement, I have to say. Joanna Lane, direct message to me. My name is Paul Gross. For those that I'm gonna write in the chat actually now for everyone, my name and my email address, and you can email me if you want to be on my mailing list for the events that we have here at the center. For those of you like Joanna who missed the opening few minutes, we have events events in English on Zoom every Wednesday at this time, and usually I have a guest with me. This is just me doing this, as I said, for those that wanted to have this sort of beginner's guide. Question from Eliyahu: Lapid flew to the USA after the election on Holocaust Remembrance Day. Why do you think he did it? I don't know. Annie Soren, Lapid is the son of a survivor. That's true. I'm not sure why he flew to the US. I don't really know the circumstances of that, I'm afraid. But it is true, he's the son of a survivor. His father, Tommy Lapid, was a Holocaust survivor from Hungary, who was himself a very prominent journalist and then politician, who, like his son, formed a political party which did very well for one election. Lapid has surpassed his father by creating a new party from scratch and sustaining it over several elections. Lapid's party, Shinui, burned very brightly for one parliament and then basically collapsed. Okay, there are no more questions, or I'll wait to see if there are any more questions. While I'm waiting for that, one thing I haven't discussed, which I do want to because I think it's really important that we haven't, is the fact that RAM, this Arab party, is in the Knesset. And there was one comment earlier from someone who thought there shouldn't be an Arab party in the Knesset. Fair enough. That's you're entitled to your opinion, as I said. Whatever your opinion, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, this is the first time this has happened. Now, a couple of things that I think are interesting to note. What RAM did that no other Arab party has done up to now is to basically say, we don't really care, or at least we're not going to talk about the Palestinian issue. Our agenda is the challenges and problems faced by Israeli Arab citizens of Israel. The Palestinian issue is something else. And it's really interesting because the fact that prior to this, Arab parties have been basically fully supportive of the Palestinian national movement, including in some cases, Palestinian terrorism, particularly controversially, obviously. That has been a major stumbling block to them being involved in Israeli politics. RAM, look, during this whole process of forming a government, you may recall, we had the whole Gaza crisis, the whole latest round in our on-off conflict with Hamas. During that period, RAM said, while this is going on, we're not going to get involved in negotiations. Okay. But when the negotiation, when it finished, they went straight back to negotiations. There was no talk of, they did not get involved at all in the criticism and condemnation of Israel by Palestinians, of course, and by some other Arabs. That's really new. That's really, really new and interesting. And what many have said is they're basically taking a leaf out of the ultra-Orthodox book. The ultra-Orthodox parties, the great success of the ultra-Orthodox parties over the past 30 years has been to say, we know what our agenda is. We know what our voters need and want. And that's what we're going to go after. And other things we can be flexible on. Other things we're not going to get involved in. Other issues we're not really going to, it's not our issues. If you Party X or Prime Minister X will give us what we want for our constituents, we'll support you. And Ram went in with that attitude. Profoundly pragmatic, not ideological. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Now the questions are coming in. By the way, if people want to leave, we've been going for over an hour. If people want to leave, by all means, go. It's been lovely having you. Thank you very much for joining. You can email me, as I said, please do, if you want to be on the list. If people want to stay and ask questions, I'll stay here as long as people are asking questions. Okay. Lisa Leff says that she's feeling optimistic. Great, Lisa, we need optimistic people. Denise Gilbert, okay. There are many illegal constructions from the Muslims, the Arabs, I think you mean, in Area C. Will Gantz also say to remove them because they didn't get any license to build, or Gantz will only zero in removing Jewish new construction? Is this part of the new government? No illegal Jewish construction, but Muslims, okay. Okay, so I think you're referring, I assume you're referring to Eviatar, which was a settlement built, an Israeli, a Jewish settlement built in Judea and Samaria, which this government has said will be removed. Benny Gantz, who Denise refers to, is the defense minister. Look, as far as I'm aware, the official policy of this government is that illegal construction from both in Area C is going to be clamped down on from both Arabs and Jews. I understand that this is a problem, that there's a lot of Arab illegal construction in Area C. As far as I'm aware, the policy of the government is that both will be clamped down on. The Eviatar, this is, by the way, is something of a departure from, look, the question of Jewish construction it's changed from government to government. When Netanyahu first came in, by the way, in 2009, he was also removing Jewish illegal construction in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. And in recent years, he's been less inclined to do that, which is kind of part of his general, I would say, his general move to more towards the settlement movement. Essentially, as he has moved more to the right on a whole bunch of issues. Some could say it's his own politics. Some could say it's his politics, that he needs their support. Whatever, you can make your own judgment about that. But yeah, it's look. Lapid made a statement about this, saying very clearly, this isn't a matter of left and right. This is a question of the rule of law. Menachem Begin famously, just going back to the quote about Begin famously, although unlike Yair Lapid, Begin, a very firm, committed supporter of settlements in Judea and Samaria and building in Jewish building in Judea and Samaria, did say that if there is building that's illegal, that's on Palestinian land, and the Supreme Court says it's illegal, then it has to be dismantled. He famously said, "Yes, Shoftim b'Yerushalayim, there are judges in Jerusalem. We're a country of the rule of law." And Lapid was basically echoing that. And he says the Haredim can be bought for money. That is indeed true, in the sense that the money, meaning money going to their causes, right? Their kollels, their yeshivot, and their school system. That is essentially what they're after, and also other things like exemptions on army service and money for funding for their schools. By the way, a very important change with this government, with this new government, because there are no Haredim, no ultra-Orthodox parties in the government, is that there will be a reduction, or even I think a complete stop of funding for ultra-Orthodox schools that don't teach core subjects, right? There are ultra-Orthodox schools that receive public money that don't teach English and math and science, and therefore produce essentially unemployable young men. And that is being stopped by this government, which is supported by not just people in this government, but I think a lot of people. Thank you to those of you who are saying thank you to me. My pleasure. Eliyahu, the EU funds Arab illegal building in Area C. Yes, I think that is true. The EU does indeed fund Arab building in Area C. And that's certainly a major bone of contention. Denise Gilbert, I really don't want to get too much into this issue because it's a contentious issue, and that's not really the topic of this talk. But Denise is pointing out, for those that are not aware, that this particular group of 50 families built on Israel land and on the site where terrorists killed an innocent civilian. Okay, I don't know the ins and outs of this. I'm pretty sure as far as the court, look, the civil administration of the West Bank, of Judea and Samaria, is calling for this to be dismantled. So I don't see how it can be on Israeli land. If you can point me to the evidence for that, then I'll reconsider. This isn't a topic I'm so familiar with. But yeah, I mean, look, this issue it's a highly political issue. It's a highly political issue. It's something that a certain section of Israeli society feels very strongly about on the settlement right of Israeli society. And it's obviously firmly opposed by the left. And then you have a whole bunch of people in the middle, including some people in the Likud, by the way, who support settlements, but believe that it has to be done in a way which is in keeping with Israeli law. Okay, I don't think there are any more questions. I thank you all for joining me. I hope it was informative and useful. Please do email me if you want to join the mailing list, paulg@begincenter.org.il. It's been a pleasure, and I will hope to see you all next week.